It smells of wet wool, ash, and stagnant water near the laundry shore. Heavy sheets swing on sagging ropes, and conversations get stuck like silt in a shoal. In the house with shutters opposite, candles are lit in the evening. Adults arrive separately, leave late, and the yard remains clean, as if they are not cooking there, but only praying and fasting. Such details make up the first page of the denunciation. The smell of oil and herbs, a closed door, a long light in the window. Everyday life is turned into evidence, like wet rags folded into a basket. Hello? Thank you for including this story. Please write in the comments which city and country you are viewing it from, and I wish you a calm but attentive listening experience. Next, we'll follow a chronicle of how a neighbor's whisper clashes with paper and myth clashes with statutes. The clerk, accustomed to measurements and descriptions, begins the ritual of reporting. He notes that the complainants are adult townspeople, separately noting the craft of the dyer, whose nose, trained to detect acids and dyes, has supposedly caught the scent of inappropriate incense. A note is made that adult strangers in dark clothes entered the house, that they gathered at the table without fatty food, and that they left late. Familiar phrases appear in the margins: temptation, mixed meals, night gatherings. It all looks like a warehouse inventory: bread, water, onions, dried herbs, candles, benches. The paper has not yet seen the bodies, but it is already binding them with the straps of words. If we put aside the dusty stories, we are left with texts, once copied by clerics, and stored in church chests. Sermons on abstinence, fasting regulations, renunciation of oaths, reminders not to shed blood, not to touch meat, not to marry after receiving the last blessing. There are descriptions of the laying on of hands, a gesture of comfort and acceptance, not a pretext for intimacy. They speak of self-control. The body is declared a cage that should be lightened with the bread of the poor, water, simple clothing, and labor, so as not to tighten the knot of attachments. There is no erotic freedom in these pages. There is discipline, dry as a list of penalties. These pages show that the doctrine is based not on the encouragement of the flesh, but on its devaluing control. The city lives by laws where marriage is insurance for inheritance, and a dowry is the foundation of a shop and workshop. Refusal to consummate the marriage after the blessing cuts off the roots of the family's usual accounting. What to do with the elders' calculations? If voluntary asceticism breaks the deal between the families on which property, craft, and debt receipts are based. This is where the first crack is forming. In the language of power, it is more convenient to talk not about the economics of marriage contracts, but about debauchery. It is easier for guards and parishioners to rally against debauchery than against an alternative ethic that devalues the flesh as a mechanism of inheritance. Thus, phrases about indecency begin to multiply in the protocols, although the inventory of confiscated items includes coarse fabrics, simple tableware, herbs, and bread. At the same time, ordinances on everyday life are in force. The authorities prescribe separate bathing and bathhouses, introduce fines for free cuts, measure the depth of necklines and the width of sleeves, as if a seam could protect the city from delusion. The guilds support this. Linen masters seek to ban puffy sleeves. Tailors seek to ban excess folds. And shopkeepers notice an increase in demand for modest fabrics. The economy of the body is set in motion. Fear turns into currency. Currency into new orders for surveillance, and surveillance into confirmation of fear. Any deviation from the everyday standard can be declared a step towards vice, and any rumor can be used as a reason to issue another receipt. A glance at the treasury books shows that the machinery of punishment is greased in advance. As soon as a mature homeowner appears in the case, a preliminary inventory is prepared. A chest, 2 frying pans, a cauldron, a skein of rope, a sack of grain, craft tools, sometimes a horse. The confiscation is divided into shares. Part goes to the authorities, part to the church treasury, and part to the maintenance of prisons and guards. Neighbors watch as seals are placed on the gates, and linen and canvas are added to the list. A simple arithmetic calculation occurs to someone. The right accusation brings in income. At this moment, the sexualized myth ceases to be just a sticky story told around the water cooler and becomes a budget in which every coin finds its place. Meanwhile, other threads are being pulled in the archives. In the lists of forbidden luxuries, alongside gold-embroidered items, are daring collars and 2 puffy sleeves, from the same category as inappropriate meetings after sunset. The bathhouse regulations require the supervisor to ensure that there is no mixing of the sexes and to fine those who stay longer than allowed. These papers are not about heresy, but they create a mirror room where any gathering of adults can easily be labeled dangerous. When voluntary asceticism, the rejection of fatty foods, and the marital bed appear in this room, the mirror is turned to reflect debauchery that is not present in the original. Meanwhile, the neighbor's whisper is patient. It is convenient to live with it because it does not require facts. The smell of oil and herbs, the light in the window, the drawn curtains are enough for it. It willingly fills the empty spaces in the protocol, like water filling a pothole. The attendant's register shows neat columns: who fed the stranger a vegetarian soup, who gave him a place to sleep, who kept a rewritten sheet about fasting and abstinence. In the age column, mature men and women are neatly entered so that no one can argue about the limits of responsibility. Next to it are laconic notes about involvement in the laying on of hands and voluntary renunciation of marriage after blessing. And yet, on the back of the sheet, like a watermark, the familiar rhetoric of temptation continues to appear. The gap between the dirty stories and the dryness of the statutes is especially noticeable when you look at the language of punishment. It is not about feelings. It is about the length of time spent kneeling, the number of days in rags, the cold water on the steps, the shackles on the ankles that rub the skin until it cracks. Physical pain here is administrative. It is measured by time, weather, and the roughness of wood. No one needs to prove a bed scene when they can show public discipline, where the body is taught to obey order until it turns from an argument into a sign. Because of this administrative perspective, abstinence looks provocative. Where the city needs bodies for marriage records, inheritance, tax payments, and craft labor, voluntarily giving up the bed after the blessing sounds like sabotage. It is easier to call this abstinence widespread debauchery and instill fear than to understand its theology. This is how the first prepared turn takes shape. Sexualization serves as a screen behind which it is convenient to hide the economy of seizures and the discipline of urban life. The second shift is already gaining momentum in ordinances, where fear of physicality is turned into a universal yardstick of control. Baths, clothing, feasts, nighttime meetings, and even the duration of silence behind closed doors are adjusted to fit it. The third shift is brewing in marriage offices, where it turns out that asceticism and purity disrupt the usual calculations between households and thus become a political threat, obscured by the word vice. By evening, the shores quiet down, but in the narrow streets, the rustling of paper under the clerk's fingers becomes more audible. They check the formulas, like a seamstress checks her stitches, comparing guest lists, meal times, and travelers' routes. In damp cells, they swallow cold water, endure days without fatty food, freeze in shackles. This is not secret torture, but the administration of weakness, in which a person begins to agree with someone else's version of their own life. Bags of grain, tools, skeins of thread, everything that can be distributed, sold, or redistributed are added to the inventory of property. Ladders are already being assembled, and firewood stacked in the squares. But for now, this is only a vision of the future. Between it and today's silence lies the glassy thickness of myth, reflecting curtains, lamps, and the dark silhouettes of adults who have come for comfort and fasting. Hands reach for the myth, and fingers accustomed to counting reach for the document. Letters between offices describe days of mercy. Adult townspeople are invited to come, repent of their connections with forbidden preachers, return the rewritten sheets, and indicate who stayed overnight with whom. The columns are filled monotonously, as if it were an inventory: bread, water, herbs, candles, benches, thin shirts, simple dishes. On the back of the same sheets, familiar formulas about temptation and mixing of the sexes reappear, although in the descriptions of everyday life there is only fasting and cramped conditions. The paper entrusted with guarding morals itself breeds suspicion, like malt in a dark storeroom. The warmth of public irritation and the dampness of rumors are enough for a thin sprout of accusation to sprout by evening. The urban routine turns into a network. Guards patrol the bathhouses, where the supervisor is required by statute to monitor the separation of baths and issue fines to those who stay longer than allowed. Tailors impose guild measures. The width of the sleeves and the depth of the neckline are now also subject to supervision. In the markets, they measure lengths of linen for modest cuts, and in taverns, they check to see if there are any extra evening feasts. There is no particular passion in these movements, only discipline, structured so that any evening spent by two adults in the same room is reinterpreted as a threat. The doctrine of asceticism, where the body must be restrained by fasting and labor, seems not just strange in such a system, but subversive. It does not fit into the economy of dowries, contracts, and inheritance, which require bodies integrated into the circle of marriage and duty. Meanwhile, in damp cells, whose walls are covered with a whitish coating, a different reckoning is taking place. There it is not fabric that is measured, but willpower. Adult defendants are deprived of fatty foods, left with cold water and bread, and forced to stand in shackles for longer hours. The skin on their ankles cracks, their fingers go numb from immobility, and their joints ache at night, when the damp air settles on their bones like a heavy shawl. This is not secret torture for the sake of confessions. It is an administrative technique of weakening. When a person gets tired, they are quicker to agree with someone else's version of their own life. They confirm that they fed the perfect ones, that they listened to instructions about fasting, that they were present at the laying on of hands. Where the paper lacks debauchery, it attributes temptation, because one is easier to translate into fines and estimates than the other into analysis of texts and dogmas. On the other side of the square, in the library hall at the chapter house, an adult keeper of manuscripts shuffles through the pages, and she has her own accounting system. She compares the accusatory formulas with the church lists of prohibitions on dancing and night songs, and sees how the clichés migrate from the memos for preachers to the court records. She notes that the kiss of peace in the treatises on mutual recognition turns into cause for temptation in later registers, and strict abstinence is renamed pretense. No one needs her notes yet. The city is busy preparing for the spectacle. But it is here that another twist emerges, one that will become important later. It turns out that the sexualized version of Heresy is based on copy-paste, not on evidence, on tracing paper, not on physical evidence. Rumors need a damning detail, and it is found in horror stories about voluntary starvation to death. Pamphlets describe the pure, who allegedly bring themselves to the end by refusing food. In the protocols, this is turned into indirect evidence of contempt for marriage and the flesh. In reality, city death records tell a simple story: lung disease, fever, winter coughs, and exhaustion in those who already ate little. Fasting, prescribed by doctrine, in these conditions becomes not a theater of cruelty, but a harsh form of self-control, sometimes dangerous, but not erotic. Here again, we see myth versus paper. The horror story was born not in the statutes of the perfect ones, but in polemics, where it is more convenient to portray the opponent as a self-destructive fanatic than to argue with his logic of refusal. Meanwhile, the chancelleries do their job without hesitation. Future seizures are divided in advance in the Treasury book. Chests, cauldrons, skeins of thread, sacks of grain, craft tools, sometimes livestock. The treasurer notes the shares, what is due to the city, what is due to the church, what is due for the maintenance of the guard. The order for canvas for the tunics of the repentant triggers an additional round of trade. Coopers and carpenters are paid for scaffolding and fences. The wheels of the economy turn smoothly, and in this lies the cold truth of punishment. Where the descriptions of guilt are vague, the estimates and statements are precise. Fear is made useful, like small change filling a purse. On the eve of the day of order, officials from the kingdom's capital send a reminder that the authorities support the actions of the ecclesiastical judges. For the city, this means that disputes over doctrinal subtleties are no longer necessary. Administrative loyalty is sufficient. The elders in the workshops understand the signal and move their meetings to an earlier hour so that they can be present in the square. Clergymen prepare formulas of repentance, firemen check the dryness of the wood, and the overseer reads out the names of adults who are assigned tunics and stocks, and those who are assigned fire. The variety of sentences is calibrated so that the demonstrative ladder of punishments eliminates further questions. But just before the spectacle begins, another folder appears, and this is a new twist. It contains notarized records of the marriages and dowries of those who visited the pure. The contracts mention adult spouses, maintenance obligations, exact amounts, and lists of property. It turns out that for many followers of asceticism, marriage records remained in force. They lived in two worlds at once, in worldly accounting and in religious strictness. This destroys the convenient image of debauched people who destroyed families. The documents show that families and property were preserved, and people met for prayer, fasting, and comfort in times of trouble. The paper that made enemies of those who entered into bed without marriage suddenly clashes with the paper where the same names are neatly entered into the bonds of marriage and duty. The administrative myth is cracked in the administrative slab itself. The crowd does not know about this. For them, what is important is the flesh put in order and the smoke that promises a quick cleansing. People want to be sure that they will no longer be subject to scrutiny just because their windows are covered with curtains. They believe that the fire will remove the sticky layer of rumors from the city. But the fire they are about to light is fueled more by dry papers than by logs. It is fanned by references to temptation, dangerous meals, and mixing of the sexes, although the descriptions mention a lean table and coarse fabric. Adult women in tunics can barely stand on their feet from the cold. Adult men move their numb fingers. Some have cracked lips. blood appears in dots, and the wind dries them to the point of pain. This is the physical check that the townspeople are presented with in exchange for a sense of security. Meanwhile, the keeper of the manuscripts does what she knows how to do. She draws parallels between the statutes and protocols, compiling excerpts into a separate bundle. Her notes are dry, emotionless. She notes where the word abstinence becomes pretense, where the kiss of peace gets a red margin note saying indecent, where prohibition of meat moves to the column strange meals. She is not able to overturn the verdicts, but she is able to create a map of lies that will show exactly how heretics are made. This is not the end, but preparation for it. When the time comes, the city will see not only the place where the fires burned, but also the table where their logic was sewn together. On the last night before the public execution of the sentences, the draft in the prison intensifies. Some of the adult defendants fall asleep sitting up, some pray silently, some stare at the wall. At the same time, the fences are being checked in the square, the ropes are being tightened, and the benches are running out of coarse fabric. It has been taken apart to make tunics for the repentant. There is nothing heroic about this, only fatigue, frozen bones, and the quiet hum of anticipation. The city breathes evenly, like a blacksmith's large bellows, before the blow of the hammer. In the morning, all this will become action, but for now, only a glassy silence in which one can hear the main thing. The asceticism recorded in the statutes and the debauchery declared in the protocols do not coincide. Between them lies a layer of fear, money, and habit. And it is this layer that is now being prepared for burning to declare it purification. In the morning, when the bells strike another hour, and the air still holds the dampness of the night, a chain of bodies in penitential tunics moves forward. Adult women walk in front, adult men follow. Most have cracked lips and fingers as gray as ashes. Everything in the square works like a workshop. Firemen check the stacking of wood. The overseer notes names. The treasurer holds a list of confiscations in his hand. The crowd's gaze slides over the bodies as if over a counter, where goods are laid out for inspection. The cherries in the vendor's tub seem out of place. Sweetness is inappropriate here. In the corner stands a cart with canvases from which additional tunics were sewn during the night. Everything is ready for a quick demonstration of order. The paper that led the prosecution now orders the body to show what discipline is: cold, the weight of iron, prolonged standing, acrid smoke. The scene is as orderly as an accounting ledger. Closer to noon, the movement slows down, and it becomes noticeable that those who are destined for fire and stocks take shorter steps than the rest. The cold wind penetrates the fabric, burning the cracks on the lips. The smell of resin, warm wood, and ash gathers into one heavy layer. The crowd begins to breathe in unison, like a blacksmith's bellows. Its desire is simple: let the city return to what it was, without suspicion, because of a candle behind a curtain. But the city, as it was, no longer exists. It has learned to read bodies like signs. Even abstinence is now punishable by law because it does not fit into the category of marital duties. Therefore, the demand for purity sounds like a request to the executioner to restore order instead of a lawyer, and the executioner is a meticulous craftsman. He works according to regulations that specify the thickness of the ropes, the height of the platform, the order of laying, and the duration of waiting. Representatives of the guilds come out from the opposite end of the square. They must be present. This is prescribed by the statutes. Their interest is material and public. They watch as the last detail of doubt falls out of the administrative machine and fear takes on a visible form. At the same time, entries are made in the treasury book about future sales of confiscated items: boilers, fabrics, tools, sacks of grain. A separate line is made for the guards' maintenance costs. Neighbors, accustomed to accurate accounting, understand that what appears to be a religious drama is in fact driven by the market. Indifference to dogma adds cowardice. It becomes more convenient to remain silent so as not to end up on the next list of confiscations. The denouement of the day looks businesslike, without ecstasy. The shackles creak, the tunics are pulled tight, the ladders leaning against the platforms are secured with knots. The adult defendants hold on as best they can. One woman's coarse linen undergarments are visible under her tunic, and there is a blue mark from a rope on her wrist. A man's fingers are like wood in the icy cold air. This is not a spectacle of blood. Here, suffering takes the form of duration and cold. When the first bonfire is lit, the noise of the crowd splits into two waves. Half watch the fire, half watch the treasurer, who, without looking up, makes notes. His indifference is the most accurate metaphor of the day. The city needs order that can be counted. After the smoke clears, traces remain on the square. A charred circle, warm ashes, hurried footprints. But the real trace remains on paper. Court clerks close their notebooks. The treasurer transfers the inventory to the sales book, and the guards receive a receipt for completion. In the evening, the shops discuss not so much what was as what will be. Where and when the auction of the confiscated goods will begin, who will get the best boilers, how much the shopkeeper will earn if he buys skeins of thread on the cheap. There is no pious joy of purification in this conversation. There is only cold interest in future profits. And this is the most cynical outcome. The purification of morals merges with the sale of property. But the myth does not calm down. The myth needs confirmation, and it is invented again. In the evening retellings, familiar formulas are heard. They talk about strange greetings, night songs, and temptation when laying on hands. These words are not backed up by new findings, but they work like a familiar melody. They are easy to repeat. They give a sense of knowledge. In the old square, where vegetable sellers sit by the fountain, a child's ball rolls across the stone, but no one pays any attention to it. Adult women arrange onions and garlic on the counters with familiar movements and discuss not the fire, but the vacant premises that have appeared at their neighbors. Recently, morality and the market have been living in the same sentence, and people no longer notice how they smell of each other. Meanwhile, in the chapter library, the silence rustles no louder than a mouse. The keeper of the manuscripts takes out a bundle containing excerpts from statutes on fasting, fragments of treatises on abstinence, notes on the kiss of peace, copies of city ordinances on baths and clothing, as well as blank forms with ready-made lines about temptation. In one row are lines that should never have been placed next to each other. It is clear how the rhetoric of accusation migrated between genres, from sermons to police records, from memos for pastors to the business books of court offices. This bundle resembles the diagram of a workshop machine. It is clear where the shaft is, where the belt is, where the flywheel is. From here we can see the mechanism, which was not concerned with proving debauchery, but with developing a unified form for fear. While she lays out the sheets, notarial records of marriages and dowries of those who visited the pure fall on the other side of the scales. They contain clear amounts, lists of dishes, fabrics, tools, and the obligations of an adult spouse for maintenance and debt. It turns out that many of those who were declared violators of family order lived according to all the norms of city law. They had contracts, guarantors, and paid for their places in the guild ranks. They did not break the system from within. They adhered to their asceticism within it. In the language of the documents, this means one simple thing. The accusation was based on rhetoric, not on facts about everyday life. And this is a new twist that is invisible to the crowd, but clear to anyone looking at the tables. Then a chain reaction of less noticeable consequences begins. Workshops that were hoping to profit from the sale of confiscated goods experience a brief upturn, followed by silence. The goods sell out quickly, the market becomes saturated, and after a few weeks, the shops are empty, because customers are afraid to make purchases in public. In bathhouses, where the supervisor strictly monitors separation and time spent there, attendance drops. Additional partitions are installed, but this does not increase trust. People are tired of suspicion and prefer to wash at home in basins. Taylor's note that demand for modest cuts has stabilized, but the joy of needlework has disappeared. When every seam is proof of propriety, fabric ceases to be a joy and becomes merely a pass. The guard makes more rounds through the night streets and, out of habit, stops at houses where the lights are on. She writes down in her notebook whose shutters are closed, who is lingering at the table. But fear, brought to the point of craftsmanship, begins to fade. It becomes clear that it is impossible to keep track of every dinner and every candle. A fatigue descends on the city, like a damp blanket. People want not so much cleanliness as silence. They need less accountability for bodies in their crowded everyday lives. But the machine has already gained momentum and needs new prey to confirm the meaning of its own work. The myth, like a millstone, needs to be fed. It is at this moment that the bundle prepared in the library finds new readers. It is viewed by 2 city clerks accustomed to forms, and 1 servant from the museum at the chapter house, where old seals and fragments of stone slabs are kept. For them, this bundle is an instruction manual for opening up the engine that turned lay people who lived in fasting into enemies. New notes appear in the margins, calm and precise, where a word renamed an action, where a formula replaced evidence, where an economic line made the moral impulse of the street understandable. It is collected into a denser scroll with a simple title that explains not who they are, but how they were made. It is only 1 step away from the hall where the display cases stand, but it will take time and permits. For now, the bundle lives on the table like a burden that cannot simply be thrown away. The townspeople who demanded fire return to their shops and workshops, and a strange emptiness appears in their conversations. It turns out that fire cannot restore the old order. It only produces smoke and confiscations. Underneath it, everything remains the same: fragile roofs, damp corners, winter coughs, debts, and a shortage of bread. The carpenter finishes the ladder for the next day of order, and realizes that he has not made an instrument of justice, but simply a ladder. The wool merchant counts her coins and notices that rumors are no longer profitable. The guard puts his hands in his pockets because there is no point in extinguishing every candle after sunset. And in this shift, in this exhaustion of fear, a muffled crack can be heard. It is the mechanism that had to create too many heretics to justify its own existence. On the last page of the treasury book for this season, there is an even sum. Proceeds from confiscations, expenses for firemen, payment for stocks, carts, canvas. At the bottom is a neat line and a brief note that order has been restored. It sounds like a report on a roof that was repaired after a storm. But the roof still leaks, and the walls are still damp. The doctrine that has been turned into a scarecrow still consists of fasting, abstinence, and control over the body. And the city, which learned to punish the flesh for debauchery, never noticed that it was punishing the rejection of the flesh. This inconsistency will remain a thorn in the side, and it will be moved to the display window later, when someone decides to show a bundle of sheets with 2 languages, fear and statute, side by side, under 1 glass. By the end of the season, the city had learned to live with a new smell, a mixture of smoke, wet wood, and vinegar from the dye works. It lingered in the narrow streets, lingered in the gateways and bathhouses, where the supervisors checked according to the charter that the queues were not mixing, and considered this to be order. But beneath this veneer, other layers were stirring. In the offices, complaints were being rewritten about clothing violations, excess fabric and sleeves, and inappropriate feasts after sunset. While in the chapter house, quiet work was underway, comparing where each formula originated, what it was based on, and how it renamed actions. The covers of internal folders bore dry inscriptions about the origins of the ecclesiastical court's authority under Pope Gregory IX, about the resolutions of the Council of Toulouse, and about how a new discipline of paper emerged from the campaign begun under Pope Innocent III. These lines harked back to an era when the southern lands of the Frankish kingdom were brought under the control of the north, and with it came a language in which the body became a convenient yardstick for loyalty. And in this language, foreign asceticism automatically looked like provocation. The social fabric, which they tried to mend with fear, continued to tear in the same places. Small craftsmen complained of dampness and colds. Doctors interpreted frequent coughs as a consequence of cold water and stone floors. And pharmacists recommended warming ointments and bitter infusions. In homes where adult widows lived, they tried to keep the pot on the stove longer and the food simpler, because excess fat was hard on the wallet. In the markets, people discussed the prices of salt and fabric, and in the queues to see the doctor, they recalled past winters when fever kept people in bed for weeks. This backdrop, which remained almost unchanged from season to season, contradicted the promise of purification. Fire left ashes, but did not cure dampness, and did not warm the bones. Therefore the city listened to the guards and fire chiefs, but increasingly looked toward the table, where a stack of discharge papers silently grew. On the table of the museum employee, who was tasked with preparing a new display case, a map of intersections was growing. In one column were the statutes of bathhouses, guild statutes for tailors, ordinances on forbidden luxury, where the sleeve, neckline, and hem length were measured as if a centimeter of fabric were a unit of morality. In another column were treatises on fasting and abstinence, rewritten by clerics. Dry prescriptions not to swear, not to shed blood, not to eat meat and eggs, to renounce the marriage bed after receiving the last blessing. Between them are protocols with repetitive phrases about mixed meals and kisses of peace, rearranged from theological language into the language of evidence. Neat arrows stretched across the margins, from the pastoral memo to the police form, from the prescription for modesty to the line about temptation. This is precisely how the main mechanism manifested itself. Sexualized rhetoric served as a universal gasket, filling the gaps between the economics of confiscation and the discipline of everyday life. The curator, accustomed to stone slabs with Latin formulas, requested permission from the chancelleries and the chapter, because without seals and visas, dangerous papers could not be displayed in the hall. The answers came slowly, but the resolutions themselves looked like a mirror of the century. They reiterated that the display of controversial treatises must be accompanied by the correct interpretation, reference to the authority of the court of faith, and concern for the souls of the townspeople. This administrative warning confirmed what was already evident in the minutes. Meaning was controlled not through facts, but through the framework within which the facts were allowed to be read. And yet, step by step, the architecture of the future showcase took shape, where 2 rows of sheets would lie side by side, so that anyone could see the discrepancy. At the same time, the senior librarian, the same one who had initially just been putting the extracts into a bundle, was doing another job that was not spectacular, but required precision. She took the register of marriage contracts from the shelf for the years after the campaigns and compiled a list of the names of those who were marked as connected with the pure. Opposite each name, 2 marks were placed, whether there were records of a marriage contract and whether there was evidence of property preservation. The result was a table that would make any zealot of broken families feel a lump in their throat. Most of the names were accompanied by quite peaceful information. Spouses were adults. Obligations were spelled out. Dowries were confirmed. And inheritance was fulfilled. The theology of abandoning the bed after the last blessing existed, but only a few professed it. And even they lived for many years in the same house under a contract that the city recognized. This table shattered the emotional scene where the family was supposedly destroyed by debauchery. In the language of the documents, there was no destruction, only a foreign ethic that interfered with the usual accounting but did not cancel it out. It was another crack in the monolith to which the square had become accustomed. While the map and table were being compiled, the links of supervision continued their work. Dominican inquisitors, invited back under Pope Gregory IX and trained in theology and paperwork, kept records where a dozen formulas were used to compile the charges. By the middle of the century, their service had become a familiar part of the city machine. They arrived, asked questions, took notes, and handed over a list of possible seizures to the treasurer. These visits looked like weighing scales being checked at the market. Everyone knew that measurements would be taken, and that it was desirable to agree on the result in advance. The royal authority, interested in strengthening order after the annexation of the southern counties, supported this unity of paper. In political terms, this meant that unity of faith and unity of the market were based on a single register of corporal discipline. Thus, whips, stocks, and clothing lists turned out to be details of a single mechanism. Meanwhile, medical truth remained down to earth. Doctors talked about dropsy in the abdomen, chest pains after winter, and aching joints, which were exacerbated by dampness. The regimens they recommended sounded very similar to the prescriptions of ascetics: moderation in food, warm infusions, dry bedding, and movement without overexertion. There was another quiet coincidence that undermined the simple picture of pretense. Some of the physical discipline from the treatises on abstinence coincided with what was recommended for health. But the city machine made no distinction between the practice of care and the practice of faith, unless they were confirmed by the right seal. Any discipline outside the registers seemed hostile. At the next Guild Council meeting, topics were raised that revealed fatigue with the myth. Tailors complained that constant checks on the depth of necklines and the width of sleeves had killed the joy of the craft and made customers suspicious. The linen rows noted that modest cuts no longer brought unexpected profits. Demand had stabilized, and excessive strictness had given rise to a black market where people sewed in secret. New partitions hung in the bathhouses, but people went there less often. Supervisors recorded a drop in fees. All this led to a quiet conclusion. Fear does not translate well into stable income if it is stretched out indefinitely. And this was the first practical incentive for the museum initiative, to show the mechanism so that, once understood, the need for constant exaggeration would be reduced. When enough permissions were finally gathered, a place was set aside for a new stand in the hall, where seals, fragments of stone inscriptions, and books of judicial formulas were usually displayed. The frame was made of simple wood, like a platform, for the condemned, only clean and light, without the smell of smoke. On the top panel, they wrote calm words about the myths of control and everyday documents, so as not to turn the display into a controversy, but to set a point of view. Below, they placed 2 rows of sheets. On the left were city ordinances, bathhouse regulations, and guild statutes, where the body is ruled by norms. On the right were translations of treatises by perfect people on fasting and abstinence, pages with instructions not to swear or shed blood, and descriptions of the laying on of hands as a form of consolation. Between the rows are cards with dry comparisons, where the kiss of peace became an occasion for temptation, where fasting is called theater, where a simple meal is renamed a dangerous gathering. A separate block contained treasury inventories and a table of marriage contracts as a bridge between doctrine and the market. At the very bottom were estimates for blocks, canvases, carts, and fire brigade payments, so that there would be no doubt about what the rhetoric was leading to. Before the stand opened, those bound by the charter arrived: church ministers, city clerks, and guild representatives. No one expected any revelations, but it would have been strange to ignore them. They read the cards without haste, and some lingered over the table of marriages, where next to the dangerous surname were the usual amounts of dowry and the names of guarantors. At that moment, it became clear that the horror story about broken families served not as a description of fact, but as a justification for the mechanism of confiscation and discipline. Another, at first glance modest, sheet hung next to the stand, an excerpt from the bull on the powers of the inquisitors, which prescribed acting with the consent of the bishop and with the participation of local authorities. Next to it lay a record of the city council, which at one time had broadened the interpretation of night checks. This pairing showed how easily authority can replace meaning. One word about night meetings turned any house with a lit lamp into a target for confiscation. The stand did not promise reconciliation. It showed a cold but important thing. Abstinence was turned into debauchery, not because someone saw forbidden intimacy, but because it was convenient for the city to translate someone else's asceticism into the language of surveillance and utilitarian morality. This conclusion was not a moral lesson, but an engineering diagram, and therefore worked more accurately than any sermon. Those who came to see the usual set of horror stories left with a new sense of heaviness. It is interesting to read about temptation until you see the estimate for ropes and shackles next to it. After that, any demand to make another exemplary day of order sounded like a request for a subsidy for the craft of fear. The townspeople, who had previously demanded fire, began to talk more often about water, bread, and roof repairs. The guards detained people less often for having lights on in their windows, and the bathhouse supervisors noticed that the partitions, installed according to the regulations, were empty. Tailors breathed a sigh of relief and set to work on fancy seams, within the bounds of everyday decency, of course, whispering that fabric was once again reminiscent of craftsmanship rather than a reference. There is no point in idealizing this turn of events. It did not abolish power over the body or erase invisible measures. But the mechanism that required endless sprinklings of anxiety suddenly had a competitor in the form of a wooden stand with documents and dry cards. This was a case where the display window did more than the square footage. At the end of the season, the museum stand was given a name, simple and accurate, without exclamation marks or sensationalism. It spoke not of those who were feared, but of how they were created on paper and in speeches. Next to it was a map of the city, marking the houses where only bread, water, herbs, and simple dishes were found. And next to it were the places where estimates for blocks, canvases, and carts were kept. This geography made it clear that the path from the kitchen to the square ran through the office, through the charter, through the guild measure, through the treasury column. People lingered at the glass, peering at the neat lines, and some of them visibly relaxed as an invisible grip was released. They left without drama, just more quietly. And that was the only honest outcome. Instead of purification by fire, purification by sight, in which myth and document finally stood side by side, like two halves of the same city history. When the display case opened to the public, not only officials and servants came, but also adult townspeople from the ranks of artisans, the very ones whose daily lives were always in plain sight. They were drawn not to the treatises, but to the estimates. People looked at the tables of confiscations longer than at the theological lines. Many had a familiar calculation in their eyes: how much canvas went into the tunics of the repentant, how much was paid to the fire chiefs, how much the blocks cost, how much could be earned from selling other people's chests. The sheet with marriage contracts, where neat sums of dowry and names of guarantors were listed opposite dangerous surnames, threw them off balance. The scene of family destruction dissolved in the registers, leaving abstinence as a personal rule and the market as a general mechanism. This did not give cause for loud conclusions, but it did teach him not to believe in simple stories that still smelled of smoke and resin. The showcase effect was not instantaneous, but persistent. The guards still walked their routes and stopped at houses with late lights. But the entries in their notebooks became more cautious, and the list of temptations thinned out. The partitions in the bathhouses were still being checked, but the supervisors were less likely to detain people for extra minutes because the fees were already falling and discontent was growing faster than the payment books could keep up. Tailors once again allowed themselves to work a little more freely with their needles, as if the fabric had regained its ability to please the eye, rather than merely attest to propriety. Shops stopped willingly accepting items stamped with confiscation. Too many people realized that a ruble earned from selling fear brought long-lasting cold into the home. Thus, for the first time, the administration of suffering ran into a limit: market fatigue. The chapter, noticing the change, was in no hurry to record it. Paper likes to defend itself. Internal memos repeated the old precautions about correct interpretation, but the word context appeared more and more often in them. This meant that one could not take the kiss of peace out of theological texts and wave it around like evidence. One could not write a theatrical post without comparing the dates of famine and disease with the parable about giving up fatty foods. Writing learned to pause, allowing one fact to connect with the next. And in this pause, the spark that had recently easily lit fires was extinguished. The shop window became crowded on market days. Adult visitors lingered over the cards, reading how the formula mixed meals had migrated from sermons to police records and left with faces marked by dull determination. Boredom here was a sign of recovery. When the passion for accusation gives way to slow reading, the body becomes safer. Several merchants from neighboring towns asked for lists of cards to show in their parishes, not out of piety, but as insurance against new waves of purges that could devour shops faster than any fire. A subtle current of horizontal solidarity arose in the chain of letters. Instead of waiting for city couriers, people began to exchange copies of documents where myth was compared with the charter. The season changed, and the city once again smelled of wet wood and vinegar. But now this smell did not conceal a ready-made scheme of punishment. Opposite the display window, another stand was set up with a map marking the locations of previous searches and a list of items found there: bread, water, onions, dried herbs, coarse tableware, and simple linen shirts. Next to it hung a short list of treasury estimates for the same quarters: shackles, canvases, carts, and payments to fire chiefs. Two columns lying next to it provided a simple calculation. It was easy to turn a poor kitchen into a square accounting system. This level of straightforwardness was unpleasant for those who built their careers on the rhetoric of temptation, but it was too obvious for those who actually fed their families and paid guild dues. Further on, it became clear how the geography of power was changing. The capital no longer sent zealous reminders about the urgent purification of morals, limiting itself to general formulas about maintaining order. At local meetings, instead of reports on night patrols, people began to discuss roofs, sewage systems at bathhouses, and fuel delivery for the winter more often. Doctors once again began to talk about how water and warmth are better remedies than force, and this harmony with some of the ascetic prescriptions, moderation, cleanliness, simplicity, ceased to be considered a sign of hypocrisy. It became part of general advice that did not require the seal of the court. Thus, dogmatic fervor gave way to practicality, where the body was allowed to be a body, tired, hungry, cold, in need of protection, rather than a clean surface for a stamp. Of course, the mechanism never completely disappeared. The treasury books still contained lines that could be revived if someone decided to turn their neighbor's anxiety into a revenue plan again. The protocols still contained formulas for temptation, ready to be copied. But the showcase became an obstacle, a slippery step on which the acceleration slips. It is difficult to bypass because it does not argue, but shows nearby. The left row of sheets continued to remind us that power over the body is convenient for discipline, while the right row reminded us that asceticism is not debauchery, but refusal, and that this refusal is dangerous above all to those who build a system on marriage as an accounting contract. The cards between the rows maintained a calm tone. It was colder than fire, but stronger than it, because it remained when the ashes died out. The fate of those adults who had gone through the tunics of penitence and stocks stood apart. Some returned to their craft because the workshops needed hands. Their clumsiness from old abrasions and cracks in their skin became part of everyday city life, invisible like the scars on the doors from previous sieges. Several names disappeared, and other flesh settled in their homes, some relatives, some who bought the property at auction. These silent movements confirmed a simple thing. Fire does not purify, it redistributes. And this, too, became part of the display, not in the form of an inscription, but as a shadow cast by the map of confiscations onto the map of kitchens. There was another line, not for the square and not for the displays, a line of internal decisions. The senior librarian, with whom it all began, bound a bundle of excerpts into a single volume and left a nameless dedication on the title page to those whose names were smeared with paper rhetoric. The clerks who reviewed her tables began to transfer the old formulas to new protocols less frequently. The curator who ordered the wooden frame for the stand insisted that all the cards be written in simple language without sensational words. These were small but humane actions, choices in favor of clarity that did not require applause and did not promise miracles. They moved the heavy machine an inch, and that was enough to make the pads less frequently used than before. By the end of the year, there were fewer late patrols in the city. Reports from the guards contained fewer references to mixed meals, and notes about extra minutes in the bathhouse registers became less frequent. Some considered this a sign of weakening morals, while others saw it as a sign that morality was no longer measured by the width of one's sleeves or the length of one's dinner. In the square, people talked more often about the prices of firewood and salt. In the shops, people argued again about the quality of fabric, not about propriety. The crowd around the display case with documents became smaller, because the initial hunger for explanations had been satisfied. Now those who brought guests stopped there and wanted to show them how ridiculous accusations are made up of familiar words and how these words are attached to the estimate. The city was gradually getting used to the idea that horror stories were a craft, and that a craft could be unlearned if you kept the machine's diagram in front of your eyes. And yet the main thing remained the same and simple. The doctrine that had once been turned into an exemplary vice was not about the intoxication of the flesh, but about its retreat. And the myth that people had been taught to see at every crossroads worked not because it reflected reality, but because it served discipline and income. When this distinction became commonplace, the cries for purity, which had previously been accompanied by smoke and iron, weakened in the city. In their place grew a silence in which only the clicking of pages under glass and the rustling of shoes on stone could be heard. This silence was enough for people passing by, not to search for the guilty, with their eyes across the width of their sleeves, but to dwell on the simple fact. Here abstinence was made into heresy, and then order was made out of it. And this could be stopped not by fire, but by the decision to look and compare. And so this story ends, not with reconciliation, but with clarity. On one side remains the memory of the cold, of cracked lips, of shackles and ladders, of the tarry smoke that started the cue for the spectacle. On the other, a calm display case where myth and document stand side by side, without exclamation marks, but with letters of equal height. Between them runs a thin thread, woven from human choices, not to seek quick punishment, not to call refusal, to sleep with someone debauchery, not to translate fear into a cost estimate. This thread is fragile, but it holds better than any rope because it consists of the habit of looking at paper longer than at fire. And if somewhere there is a smell of wet wool and ash water again, this smell will be a reminder not of the coming bonfire, but of how important it is to take the folder out of the closet in time, where two truths lie, and read both evenly.